Can you turn the light off? Yeah, it's better off, I think. Off.
This?
No, this one's off. Oh, okay. No, this is fine.
Вот, отлично, да, мы, вероятно, можем начинать. Добрый вечер всем. Меня зовут Никита Косолапов, и я представляю факультет городского и регионального развития Высшей школы экономики. И наш факультет продолжает цикл еженедельных лекций в библиотеке Достоевского. И сегодня наш гость, профессор Ян Брукнер, профессор городской экономики Университета Калифорнии. И одной из сфер научного интереса профессора является влияние регулирования землепользования и застройки на городскую экономику и на городские процессы в целом. И этому сегодня будет посвящена его лекция. Ну что, давайте поприветствуем профессора.
Okay, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. My first visit to Russia. So it looks like you're mostly students, am I right? How many students? Okay, not everybody. I see some non-students out there too. All right, so today I want to talk about the subject of urban sprawl, which is a worldwide phenomenon that is of concern in many countries around the world. So I'm going to talk a lot about the United States perspective on this phenomenon. In particular, that's a perspective based on a free market economy. Now, I know that Russia has made great strides toward the free market, but everything I say may not be quite applicable to Russia because of the differences in the two systems. And so you know better than I do what your country is like, so you'll be able to adjust what I say based on what you know about how this economy works. So urban sprawl is about the spatial expansion of cities, the phenomena by which cities spread out and take up more land. And so in the United States, for example, the share of the land area occupied by cities is pretty small. The United States is a very big country, sort of like Russia in that sense, and the cities only take up about 2% of the land area. And I imagine that the number for Russia is similar to that. But the amount of land that's occupied by cities has been growing rapidly for years and years and years. So in the U.S., over one recent period where there's measurement, the rate of expansion of urban spatial sizes is 2.5% per year, which is quite fast, bigger than population growth in the United States. In fact, the spatial expansion in many cities exceeds the rate of population growth. So they're growing spatially faster than the amount by which population is expanding. Now, there's a lot of criticism of urban sprawl in the United States. And the criticism is now starting in other countries. Now, those of you whose English is good will understand that sprawl is sort of a bad word. It sounds like something bad, right? There's almost a value judgment in the term sprawl, implicitly saying that it's something undesirable. So that's sort of strange because sprawl is also a descriptive term that says that cities are spreading out. But wrapped up with the description is this judgment that something's wrong. And so we want to talk about that at great length here today. Now, Moscow is no exception to the pattern of urban sprawl, and that's maybe why many of you are here today to hear this talk. Data from a recent book by Shlomo Angel show that over the period from 1991 to 2002, even though Moscow's population fell by 5%, at least the city, I guess, this is the city population, the city's land area grew by 44%. Similar things have happened in some U.S. metropolitan areas. For example, the city of Cleveland, which is not a growing city, its population fell, but its land area grew. So this phenomenon of falling population, growing land area is not unique to Moscow. But look, here's a picture that comes out of the book that I just told you about. And so the red area is the built-up area, and the yellow is sort of peri-urban, not quite built up. You can see there are little dark red areas in the middle of this. We'll take a look at the red area in Moscow. It's much bigger. And this is the second year. This is 2002. So quite dramatic, actually. And this book actually has maps like this for 120 different cities around the world. So you can look at sprawl all over the world by, and the reference to the book is at the end of this talk if you want to copy it down. Now, I just heard yesterday from from Irina here that, in fact, Moscow has been annexing city area outside the historic city. Now, my guess is that these annexations are fairly recent. Is that correct? So that wouldn't be captured here. In other words, this is almost 20 years ago in 2002. So whatever annexations have been happening that cause Moscow to expand spatially predate or postdate this phenomenon. So this seems to be real, honest to God, urban sprawl. It's not annexation. Okay. Now, why don't people like urban sprawl? Why do they criticize it? Well, there are a whole list of reasons. You know, in the U.S., people talk about paving over the landscape. And so along with that idea is the notion that there is a loss of farmland. In other words, not enough land to grow crops. This kind of concern is really strong in China, for example. There's very great concern about food security in China, and so China worries about loss of farmland, even though their urban growth is among the fastest in the world. So another issue is loss of open space and its benefits. So as cities get really big, it takes a long time to get to the countryside. You have to drive or take a train a long way to get to open space. And so the benefits from open space are not realized as easily when a city is expanding spatially. Another issue is air pollution. So when cities are spread out, people drive more. It takes longer to get to the city center if that's where your job is. And so more driving means more air pollution. So that's an issue. Another phenomenon is reduced incentives for downtown development. So in cities that are sprawling, you can always build on the edge. And so there's less incentive to redevelop the aging buildings in the downtown area. And so you get what's called blight in the United States, deterioration of central city buildings. And so that's another consequence of sprawl. Now, you know, people have thought of a million reasons why sprawl is bad. And there are two other ones that are related to sort of behavior, people's behavior. And one claim is that urban sprawl reduces social interaction. And yet the argument there is that when people live at low densities, as they do in the suburbs, they don't interact as much. We'll see whether that's true in a little while, but that's one of the claims. There's another one that's almost funny, and that is that it's argued that sprawl makes people fat. And why does it do that? Well, I guess the image you have to have in your mind is somebody in New York City who's running for the subway and walking to the grocery store, walking to the doctor's office, walking everywhere, versus somebody in the suburbs of New York City who's driving everywhere. So people living in Manhattan in New York get lots of exercise every day. And in the same way, people in European cities get lots of exercise. But in American suburbs, not so much exercise unless they go to the gym. Exercise is not a consequence of daily life in the same way that it is in a European city or Moscow or many other places. And so I'll tell you whether or not this is actually true, at least from an economist's point of view. Economists have been very dubious about this claim, and we'll come to that later. Okay, so in response to the concerns about urban sprawl, land use policies in the United States increasingly are targeted toward it to restrict the spatial expansion of cities. And one of the things that's done is called an urban growth boundary. In Europe and elsewhere, these things are called green belts. Essentially, a green belt or a UGB, an urban growth boundary, says you cannot build outside a particular circle. It's green out there. You can't build on it. So that's one thing. Another thing is that some cities and states actually buy up vacant land around cities. They purchase vacant land so that it's not available for development. So, you know, quite a bit of money has been spent on these land purchases in the United States in various places. Another thing that happens is that cities impose development fees. They make it more expensive to develop land. And so builders aren't as ready to undertake development with these kinds of fees. So in Europe, the policies against urban sprawl have been restrictive for a longer time than they have been in the United States. I mean, for example, the green belts are widespread in the United Kingdom. Lots of green belts in the UK that are bottling up cities. And green belts are also in other places in the world. Korea has lots of green belts that prevented cities from expanding. One thing that's interesting is that there's not really a good catalog of anti-sprawl policies around the world. If somebody could do that work, it would be very difficult to construct such a catalog because you need to find online information about every single country and make a list of what the policies are. There isn't such a list, so we don't really know. It's all anecdotal. So, you know, sprawl policies in Russia, I don't know. You probably know something. Maybe later you could tell us what these policies are, if any. Okay. So you've heard me talk about this in a way that's perhaps a little bit dubious. In other words, like I don't believe the sprawl criticism. And so the question is, even though the criticisms sound right, are they right? Or are they in some sense misguided? So the question is are the criticisms well-founded from an economic perspective? Do they make economic sense? Do cities really take up too much space? Should anti-sprawl measures be adopted? And so the tools of urban economics will give us answers to these questions. Now, the thing is that economists and their viewpoints may sound a little bit strange to urban planners. I suspect many of you are urban planners, right? From the School of Urban Planning at HSE. But economists, we think that we're right. We think that we have the right perspective on things, partly because everything's very logical and based on sort of first principles. And so if you're just listen to what I have to say and see whether it makes some sense to you. But clearly, planners don't always see things the same way. Often do not, as economists. So what I want to do to start with is to show you how the tools that we've got can be used to analyze this question is to talk about the basic urban model that has been developed, that has been the workhorse tool in urban economics since the 1960s. And it's a mathematical model of urban land use that kind of ends up describing what we see in cities. It shows it's a scientific model that tries to predict why cities look the way they do, and it does a pretty good job of predicting what the spatial structure of cities looks like. Okay? And so many of you probably studied this theory a little bit in your courses, but let me just review how it works. So the key to the urban model is the notion of a compensating differential. In other words, everybody in the city should be equally well off in a city full of identical people. And so if you're at a disadvantage, you should be compensated for it. Otherwise, you wouldn't tolerate the disadvantage. And the disadvantage in particular that's important is some people have to drive a long way to get to work. Some people have long commutes. And so those people would be worse off unless they were compensated somehow. And the market does the compensation by having lower land rents in the suburbs than in the center. So land is expensive near the center. Why? Because people have an advantage there. They have a short trip to work. In the suburbs, land is cheaper to compensate for the long commutes. And so that says as distance from the city center increases, urban land rent falls. Okay? But now, how do we determine how big the city is? Well, the theory gives a simple rule for doing it. And the rule comes out of the fact that, at least in the United States, housing developers compete with farmers or other alternate users for use of the land. In other words, if you want to develop, you've got to get the land away from who's ever using it now. And oftentimes that individual is a farmer. And so what that means is that there's this competition. And basically, the thing that guides the competition is the agricultural rent. That's how much rent the land generates in agricultural use. So in Las Vegas, for example, the agricultural rent is about zero because there's nothing you can do with that land. It's desert. Okay. In central Illinois, where I lived at one point, land is very productive and very expensive. And so the competition with farmers is different depending on where you are. But the main thing that comes out of this is that the edge of the city is a distance from the center where the urban land rent drops below the agricultural rent. When the urban land rent is below the agricultural rent, the housing developers cannot bid the land away from farmers. They're not willing to pay enough for it. And so it stays in farming. but where the housing developers can outbid the farmers, they can pay more than the agricultural rent, then the land is converted and it becomes a city, becomes urban. Okay? So that basic idea then is what determines the edge of the city. So this is like crucial to urban sprawl because it's the mechanism that determines the city's footprint, how big the city is. Okay? Now, and so this is basically a mathematical model, but we can analyze it different ways. In fact, I have a book that does a textbook that presents a non-mathematical depiction of the urban model. And if you're interested, I can give you the reference for the book. But anyway, analysis of this model generates a bunch of conclusions, some of which are pretty obvious. The first one, which is the most obvious, is that the edge of the city moves outward as the urban population rises. So that says, obviously, that more populous cities take up more space than smaller ones. Okay? No big deal. We don't need a model to tell us that, but there are a few other things that maybe are not quite so obvious. The second one is pretty natural too, though, and that is that the edge of the city moves inward as the agricultural rent rises. So that says as if the city is on a really productive farmland, it's not going to be as spread out as a city that's on, like Las Vegas, that's located where the land is almost worthless in anything but urban use. Okay? Now, one thing that this says is that, before I get to these others, this says that high productivity agricultural land is more resistant to urban expansion than low productivity land. And so people who are worried about losing farmland should take comfort from this fact, because it says that if the land is really productive, it's going to resist urban expansion. It's not going to get converted as easily. So this notion about the loss of farmland being a concern is just not true. It's wrong. Farmland can take care of itself, basically, in competition with cities. It's only when the land doesn't command a very high rent that it gets converted. Okay, the third thing is that the edge of the city moves inward as the cost of commuting rises. So commuting costs may be high in a place because it has really terrible roads or a really poor public transit system that's slow and inefficient, so it takes a long time to get to work. So it makes sense that when commuting is expensive, that people want to be close to the job center in the middle. So the city's not going to take up as much space. It's going to have a smaller footprint. And what this says, for example, is if the price of gasoline rises, or the price of oil doubles, and so therefore the price of gasoline rises, that's going to put pressure on cities to become more compact. Because now commuting is going to be more expensive. Cities won't get more compact right away, but in the long run, they'll become more compact as people try to stop driving as much. The last effect is that the edge of the city moves outward as the incomes of residents rise. Somebody can sit up here. One more. I like to be able to look in. Okay, the next thing is that the city moves outward as the resident income rises. Well, why is this? Well, if you've got more money, you're going to want a bigger house. And that bigger house is going to take up more land. Now, the same thing goes if you're living in apartment buildings. You want a bigger apartment building. The apartment building spreads out. It gets bigger. It takes up more land. So the point is that higher incomes are going to cause cities to spread out more. Okay, so these things are what I call fundamental forces that generate urban spatial expansion. Rising city populations, no surprise. Rising incomes, perhaps less obvious. And falling commuting costs. In the US, the falling commuting costs are mainly a result of highway investment. In the United States, since 1955, thousands of miles of freeways have been built. Many of those miles are improving access within cities. Many of the freeways are connecting cities, but many are within cities too. So sprawl is mainly driven by these fundamental forces. And it's hard to argue with these. It's clear that those things are going to cause cities to spread out. Now you might think, how is it that a city's population could fall and it expands spatially? Well, one thing that could happen is people got richer. And so even though there are fewer people, they demand more housing, and so the city takes up a bigger footprint even though it has fewer people in it. So that's why Cleveland got bigger even though its population is falling. And who knows, I suppose the same thing is true in Moscow. Russian incomes have been rising, or at least until a recent period they've been rising. Standard of living has gotten bigger, and so more housing, bigger urban footprint. Okay? Now there's a literature on this that confirms the role of these fundamental forces. So I have a paper with a student back in 1983, before you all were born, most of you, and it confirms this. And what does it do? It looks at the connection between the urban land area and measures of population, income, and commuting costs, and it shows that indeed these forces have the predicted effects. Okay. So now, so it's clear then that from this argument that there are strong reasons for cities to spread out. There are strong reasons for urban spatial expansion. But the way that economists think about this problem is to ask, even though the fundamental forces are there, is their effect distorted by market failures? So what's a market failure? A market failure is something that causes the free market to do the wrong thing. Market failures are all around us. For example, pollution from factories involves a market failure. The factory is not doing what's socially correct in generating all that pollution. Why? Because the factory's owners are not thinking about the damage they do. They don't care. Another example is monopoly. If you have one company that's cornered the market on a good that it produces, it can raise the price. And so monopolies are often regulated, at least in the United States, to make sure they don't do that. So without competition, you can get market failures. So market failures are all around us. They're everywhere. So the question is, are there market failures involved in the process that determines spatial sizes of cities? If so, then the critics of urban sprawl have a point. They're right. So, if there are these market failures, then the cities take up more space than they should. From society's point of view, from a social welfare point of view. Now, economists have identified a number of such market failures, and I have a paper that's an easy sort of non-technical treatment of what's the economic thinking on market failures regarding spatial expansion of cities. And again, it's in the list of references at the end. Okay, the first one is failure to account for open space benefits. Remember we talked a little bit before about the benefits of being able to drive out to the countryside? Well, if these amenity benefits from open space exist, it's likely, almost certain, that developers are not going to take them into account in their development decisions. Okay, so think about it. When a developer is deciding whether or not to develop a piece of farmland for housing, the developer thinks, okay, I've got to pay a certain amount of rent for this farmland, and that's basically the rent that the farmer is currently paying for it. And so that's the cost. And if by paying that cost I can make a profit, fine, I'm going to develop the land. But there's another cost to development that the farmer's not thinking about. It's the lost benefits of open space that the land generates. So in fact, the cost of development, the true cost of development is bigger than the developer thinks it is, because the developer is not considering the open space benefits that disappear when the land is developed. And so what that means is there's too much development. Now, I'll come back in a minute about this, whether this open space story, this idea of open space benefits makes sense. But let's just take it for granted a moment. So, how to reduce the overexpansion of the city? Well, The Economist has an exact answer to that question. And the exact answer is we ought to charge developers for the benefits that they destroy when they convert open space to housing. If we have a dollar value for that thing, that open space benefit, we can charge them for it. And now the developer is going to think, oh, there's the agricultural rent that I've got to pay to get the land away from the farmer, but I also got to pay the government this development fee. So now the developer is taking into account the lost open space benefits that result from the development decision. And so the developer is going to be less enthusiastic about development because it's more expensive. Okay? Another thing one could do is impose an urban growth boundary. So an urban growth boundary actually is equivalent to this development tax. You can do either policy, assuming that you set the numbers correctly. The two policies are exactly equivalent. That's something that's not at all obvious without some economic analysis, but the two policies are the same. Now, local governments like zoning laws. They love to zone things and restrict land use in various ways. So local governments would certainly probably like the urban growth boundary better than a development tax, because they can use their zoning power to stop the city from growing. The most famous urban growth boundary in the United States is in Portland, Oregon. But there are many other similar things around various parts of the country. And as I said, they're all over Europe, UK, and elsewhere. Now, this open space story that I told you sounds okay, but then you might think, really? Do I care? Suppose I live in Chicago. Do I care about whether there's an acre of corn 40 miles from the center of the city gets paved over for housing? Really? Well, if I'm a Sierra Club person, you know the Sierra Club? Anyway, it's in one of the main environmental groups in the U.S. If I'm a Sierra Club person, I may really lose something from that acre of corn land being developed. But for a lot of people, they could care less. They like open space, but what do they care? They actually they care whether there's a city park down the street from where they live. So this open space story that I've been telling you may be a little bit shaky. It's not quite clear that it actually describes the way everybody thinks about this problem. It may describe the way some people think, but probably not everybody. A lot of people are just oblivious. They don't care about loss of open space on the urban fringe. A lot of the people who care about it in a conceptual manner. It's not like they go driving out to the countryside, but they like knowing that it's there, that it's close, right? But what if the city government in the urban area is full of people who belong to the Sierra Club? Well, city government may impose an urban growth boundary because they think it's the right thing to do. But it could be that that doesn't represent the right thing from the point of view of their constituents, the people in the city. Because one thing that happens when you impose an urban growth boundary and you do anything to restrict urban development is that the supply of land and housing goes down and housing prices go up. So if you're going to restrict urban development, you're going to raise the price of housing. And so this Sierra Club guy who runs a city may be doing the wrong thing. He may be harming his constituents by raising their cost of living, when in fact they don't care at all about the open space issue. There was an interesting ballot measure in Arizona, like I don't know how long ago, in the early 2000s, and there was the ballot was whether or not to impose land use restrictions, basically growth boundary. And there was a very interesting coalition of people against the measure. One was the developers. They don't want any restrictions on development, okay? But another member of this coalition was a consumer affordable housing interest group. In other words, an interest group pushing for affordable housing in Phoenix, the city where this happened. And what that shows is that the affordable housing interest group, they understand the economics of the problem. They know that if you bottle up the city by restricting development, it's going to raise housing costs, and that's not good for people concerned about affordable housing. So that particular interest group understood the economics, but lots of people don't. They think, okay, good, let's stop this urban sprawl, without thinking that in fact it can reduce the standards of living of people in the city in the long run. Okay, now a second market failure is one that all economists agree on. This is not, there's no doubt about this particular one. And it may sound a little bit abstract, but let me try to explain it. And the market failure is unpriced road congestion. So here's the logic. Here's the logic behind this thing. There's something called the congestion externality, which is well recognized by economists and others. And an externality is when you do something and it imposes costs on other people. Okay? And the congestion externality works as follows. When an extra car gets on the road gets slightly more crowded and everybody slows down. So all the other drivers slow down just a little bit, but if we add up the slowdown across all the people on the road, it's a non-trivial amount. So an extra driver slows down all of the fellow drivers on the road in a way that when you add it up, there's a real damage there. But the extra driver doesn't take this into account. When I get on a crowded road, I'm not thinking, oh, I'm going to slow everybody else down. Or I may know that I'm going to do it, but why should I care? I only care about me, not about them. So the externality is a problem. It's a market failure because people do not consider the damage that they're doing to their fellow drivers by being there on the crowded roadway. Just like the polluting factory doesn't care about the pollution damage it's creating. And so that's a market failure. And another way of saying it is that the social cost of commuting is higher than the private cost. The private cost is what I perceive to be the cost. That's how long it takes me to get to work and my gas costs. The social cost is that private cost plus the damage I do to everyone else by being present on the road. So social cost is higher than private cost. And what that means is that there's too much commuting. In an urban spatial context, what it means is that people are driving too far. Their commutes are too long. And in turn, what that means is that the city is too spread out. So because people perceive commuting to be cheaper than it really is, they do too much of it, and the city takes up too much space. Okay? Now, the remedy here is to impose a congestion toll, which charges each driver for the externality damage. Now, you all know and heard about the congestion tolls that are in place in different cities around the world. The first one was in Singapore, and that system has gotten more sophisticated and using electronic methods to charge people. Basically, you have a transponder in your car. You get charged if you enter the center of the city. It shows up on a bill later in the month. And there's a London congestion toll, which uses sort of a low-tech, but actually sort of high-tech system. And the way it works is that because London has zillions of video cameras all over the place, the videos are constantly reading license plate numbers. And if they see your car in the center of London and you haven't paid the toll, you get a fine. So you got to pay a big toll, like $12, £10 or something, to drive into central London. So that's a lot of money. And so the London's congestion toll has reduced congestion in the center of the city. Stockholm also has congestion tolls now, and New York City may start having them soon. There's going to be the proposal is to charge anyone entering a lower Manhattan below, like, I don't know, Central Park, basically. Anyone entering lower Manhattan is going to pay a toll. So that's almost the same as London's ideas. Basically, it's when you cross a particular line, then you're subject to the toll. Okay, so if we do this, if we were to raise these commuting costs by imposing a toll, what do we know from our theory about this urban spatial size? As the commuting cost goes up, the city shrinks, right? That was one of our fundamental forces. And so that's what's going to happen. In the long run, the city is going to shrink. Now, you have to understand that the city isn't actually going to shrink, but it's not going to grow as much as it would have otherwise. We're not going to tear down part of the city and return it to farmland because we put in a congestion toll. But in the long run, the city's not going to be as big as it would have been without a toll. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that you might think that an urban growth boundary would be you could use that instead of a congestion toll to deal with this problem? The answer, it's not true. And it's not obvious either that that's the case, but the mathematical analysis shows that an urban growth boundary is not going to do the job. So, you know, among economists, there's little doubt about the relevance of the congestion externality. And city leaders have signed on to this because around the world they've been imposing congestion tolls, which, by the way, is a politically hard thing to do because it's a tax and people don't like taxes. But one place we need congestion tolls is in Los Angeles, by the way. Los Angeles has some of the worst traffic in the United States, and people spend untold numbers of hours stuck in crowded freeways. And the entire city revolves around calculations about, gee, when should I go to avoid traffic? It's terrible. But again, you try to impose a congestion toll, it'll be a revolution. People need to get to work and they don't want to pay more. Anyway, it happened in London, in these other places. It's not quite clear how they pulled it off, but it's the right thing to do. Okay, so how big is this? Is the effect of this unpriced road congestion? Well, if you look at mathematical models of the city, and you have this congestion problem, the city radius is about 10% too large, so it's a pretty big effect. In other words, the city is 10% too spread out. If you don't do anything about this unpriced road congestion. Now, what's the toll? Well, it's not trivial. It depends. You know, you can calculate it a bunch of different ways. But the toll that comes out of the mathematical models is about 17 cents a mile. So people end up paying a decent amount of money in tolls when a toll is imposed. Now, the thing is that the London toll doesn't translate. It's not done in that fashion. It's not a per mile toll. It's a big lump sum amount when you cross this cordon into the center of the city. And all of the tolls that we've got around the world are not this idealized one where you charge everybody per mile. They all have this feature. If we were to do it in LA, however, we'd want to do it per mile toll. Because there's no kind of center to LA. People are driving all over the place. So you can't sort of draw up a line and say, if you go across the line, you're going to pay the toll. Okay, there's another distortion that I won't tell you about. It comes from mispriced urban infrastructure. And the idea here is that new development requires infrastructure. And what you should do is charge the developer for the marginal cost of the new infrastructure. You should charge for the cost of extending the sewer lines, extending the street network. But the way, in the United States, the way things have often worked is that developers pay average cost, not marginal cost. So you may think that sounds like economics mumbo jumbo, but basically, if the marginal average costs are different as they're likely to be, then doing it this other way makes development look too cheap to the developer. Now, in fact, in the United States, for at least 20, 25 years now, localities have been levying what are called impact fees. Now, urban planners probably know about impact fees, right? Well, you may have heard of them, but impact fees are when if you're going to build a house, the city government says, well, this house is going to cost $5,000 in new road infrastructure. It's going to cost $3,000 in new sewer infrastructure, and so on. And so I'm going to levy on the developer a $20,000 impact fee to pay for all this stuff. That's the right thing to do from an economic point of view, because it makes the developer take account of the actual cost of the infrastructure that is needed by the new development. And once you pay once the impact fees levy, nobody else has to pay. Under the old system, all the existing city residents help pay for extending the infrastructure to the new development. This way, only the new guys pay. So that's good. That's the way it should work. All right, what about other externalities? There's an emissions externality, right? We talked about that before, that there's more air pollution when people drive farther. So when I'm driving to work, I don't care about the fact that I'm creating greenhouse gases, or I might, but I'm still going to drive. I'm not going to let the fact that I'm creating pollution change my trip to work. So we should be charging people for the emissions that they generate too. And that's going to be sort of like charging a congestion toll. So I have a paper with a German colleague that shows that if you've got emissions going on, which actually come from two places, they come from commuting and also from residences. Heating and cooling generates emissions too. And so our paper shows that you need to tax people for driving. This is not a congestion toll, it's an emissions toll. And you need to tax real estate in a particular way in order to get the occupants of housing to recognize that their heating and cooling is generating emissions. Now, one thing that this model has got in it, which you may have heard about or know about, is the notion of emissions economies from tall buildings. Tall buildings, it is known, are more energy efficient than short buildings. And so like you would like to encourage higher density if you want to reduce the city's emissions. The reason why tall buildings are energy efficient is because the surface area of a building, which is what matters for heating and cooling, goes up less rapidly than the internal square feet as the building gets taller. So that's why a tall building is better than a short building when it comes to emissions. So anyway, if you put on these taxes here, we get a spatial shrinkage of the city. So we talked about three externalities: open space, congestion, and emissions, and they all require remedies and they all lead to spatial shrinkage. Another thing is the sprawl and blight idea. So I have a paper with Robert Helsley that shows that when cities, just exactly what I said before, when cities spread out too much, with too much land developed in the center, then the center has inefficiently low building reinvestment. So you get blight in the center by having sprawl. And so if you impose the corrective policies we've just been talking about, they reduce central blight. So that's good. It's like a bonus for fighting sprawl. You get a blight bonus. You get redevelopment in the center, and that's good. Now, a student who was visiting my university wrote a really nice paper based on this idea, and she provided empirical support for this notion. She said that she showed that cities with urban containment policies, and these can be different types of policies. One would be an urban growth boundary, and there are various other policies that she tabulated. Cities with urban containment policies have lower blight. So that's great. That proves the point. Now, okay, what about urban sprawl and behavior? First, let's talk about urban sprawl and social interaction. So many people, commentators, claim that low-density living reduces social interaction by spreading people out. There's a famous sociologist named Robert Putnam who wrote a book called Bowling Alone. I don't know if you've heard about this book. Somebody's shaking their head. And one of the central claims in the book is that the pattern of urban growth in the U.S. is reducing social capital, reducing our social bonds with one another. And a lot of people think this is, thought this is true. And so a colleague and I decided to do an empirical test of this idea. And what we did is we got social interaction information from a U.S. survey. There are various surveys in different countries. There's ones in the United States, ones in Europe and Germany in particular, that ask people lots of questions about friendships and civic activities and stuff like that. And so this survey, I can't remember the name of it, Social Capital Benchmark Survey, I believe, has a whole bunch of questions about social interaction. It's like, how often do you talk to your neighbors? Do you belong to a neighborhood club? Do you invite people over for dinner? Those kinds of questions. And so what we did is we combined this, this social interaction information with census tract data on population density. So it's a simple idea. You got somebody's answer as to their amount of social interaction, and then you know how dense the census tract is that they live in. And so you regress social interaction on density. Now there's some various econometric issues that that come up here. And lo and behold, we get the absolute opposite conclusion. That low density reduces social interaction, or conversely, low density raises social interaction, or high density reduces it. So here's the idea. This is the way I think about it. If you live in New York City, you're on the subway with people, you're getting jostled on the sidewalk and all this stuff, and when you get home, you just want to shut the door and be done with it, right? And so you don't want to talk to anybody. You don't want to talk to your neighbors. But in the suburbs, in the U.S. suburbs, people have nice houses and they have front lawns and they're out mowing their lawn and they start chit-chatting with their neighbors and they get to know them. And so low density raises social interaction according to these results. Now, there was a particular urban planner who came across this finding. And this guy corresponded with me a lot, and he was extremely angry about it because it contradicted his views on the effects of urban sprawl. The guy was really crazy. I think he was a little bit nuts, actually. But so I was really shocked by that. I never had that kind of thing in my career before, to have somebody like attacking me for research results. Okay, so how about urban sprawl and obesity? So a lot of studies look at the connection between obesity and urban sprawl. And many of these papers are by non-economists. And what they tend to show is a positive association between BMI or body mass index and the extent of sprawl. So what they do is they get data on individuals and they know their BMI, and then they also know where they live. And so they can relate the sprawling nature of that city and whether they're in the suburbs to the body mass index. And so people tend to interpret this result as a causal link. In other words, sprawl causes obesity. And one thing that economists have gotten very good at doing in the last 20 years is trying to measure causal links as opposed to just correlations. So in fact, what these people found was just a correlation. It's not a causal link. And their empirical methods didn't allow them to correctly claim a causal link. And so there's one paper in economics that kind of rebuts this argument. And the paper shows that this correlation between body mass index and sprawl is a result that's due to self-selection. And what this means, what self-selection means, is that obese people choose to live in the suburbs. So if you think about it, if you're overweight, why would you want to be running for the subway in New York City, in downtown in Manhattan? You'd rather live in the suburbs where you can drive around. That's the argument. So, and how did they figure out this, that the result was due to self-selection, that it's not causal? What they did is they had a data set that allowed them to look at people who moved. In other words, it was a longitudinal data set, and they could see that some people moved out of the central city into the suburbs, right? Other people didn't. Other people lived in the suburbs the whole time. Other people lived in the central city. So if living in the suburbs makes you fat, then they should have observed an increase in body mass index when people moved, or 5 years after they moved, right? But they didn't. There was no effect of moving to the suburbs on people's body weight. And so that says there's no causal link between the two things. So this is one of my favorite Sprawl papers, actually. Okay, so I hope that I've given you a flavor for how economists think about urban sprawl. So it can be analyzed using the tools of urban economics. And the conclusion is that sprawl is mainly driven by fundamental forces, population, income, and commuting costs. But there may be distortions to the growth process caused by market failures, which lead the spatial expansion of the cities to be somewhat too large. It's not dramatically too large. Cities aren't twice as big as they should be. They're maybe 10 or 15% bigger than they should be in terms of footprint. So it's wrong to go on the rampage against urban sprawl and try to bottle cities up into much smaller areas. That's a bad idea. But we should try to maybe slow down the rate of urban growth through certain policies. So an overzealous attack on sprawl is not a good idea because it can essentially bottle people up in cities that are too expensive to live in. But some attempt to reduce urban expansion is a good idea. Okay, here's some references. I'm sure you can get your access to these slides somehow, right? Are these slides going to be made available?
I think they have a translation right now, so we'll be able to look
okay.
up on it.
All right, so here's the paper. Here's the book with these 120 maps of sprawl around the world. It's pretty nice. Hard to get your hands on, though, presumably. Here's my paper about building heights and energy efficiency. Here's the sort of simple, non-technical discussion of some of the issues that I've been telling you about. Here's a paper of measuring how the fundamental forces cause cities to spread out. Here's a paper about social interaction. Here's the paper about urban sprawl. I love the title of the paper. It's called Fat City, questioning the relationship between urban sprawl and obesity. And then here's the paper about urban containment policies and blight. Okay, so nobody's asked any questions so far, so now's your chance. And you can also object to what I'm saying here. You don't need to. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture, very insightful. And my question is, so one of the prerequisites of most of your models is that you have a city center,
right,
which is full of business where people travel.
True enough.
And so, this causes these distances, right?
Yes.
So two questions. First of all, have you tried to model a city, a tax actually on business? Because according to game theory, we know that business will flock in the center.
Right.
So you impose taxes on people who drive, but not on the business.
Okay, so you want the businesses to move out closer to the people.
Maybe.
Yes, good point. So this whole story I've been telling you about is based on what's called the monocentric city model, where all the jobs are in the center. Now, increasingly, that's not a description of actual cities. Cities are polycentric. And so a lot of the things I've been saying here also apply in a polycentric city. And one reason why we have polycentric cities is if these businesses want to move out. The center gets too expensive. They want to move and be closer to their workers. So cities are doing exactly, businesses are doing exactly that. Now, it's sort of an interesting idea. Maybe a sprawl policy would involve, I don't know, would it be right? Encouraging businesses to decentralize? Well, that sounds like it might worsen sprawl. But anyway, it's a complicated issue.
Well,
but you're right.
You explain why sprawl is bad. So it is bad because of the distances. And
right.
everything that causes by the distances. So.
Right, but if you if there are lots of job centers, then the city might be even more spread out. That's the thing. It's a complicated question exactly what the right approach is when you have job decentralization. But many of the same principles are still going to apply. It's just it will be a little harder to formalize.
Okay. Can I ask
sure.
Second question? Second question is, have you modeled competition between cities? Because I heard about city and the suburbs, rural suburbs, right?
Yeah.
If we model competition between cities.
Between cities and suburbs?
No, between different cities. Do you think there could be some other conclusions?
I mean, competition between cities has lots of ramifications, but it's not. I'm not quite seeing how it's going to link up with the notion of urban sprawl. There are some papers that have been written about competition between cities, and I can't remember exactly what their conclusion was. But it's a good question, though. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
Yeah. I have a question. It is more an observation, because I think that in the context of this presentation there is a point, a very important point that is absent. And that point is the cost of maintenance. Because, for example, impact tax, why it is useless? Because the infrastructure has building cost and maintenance cost, and maintenance cost is much larger over time, which means even if you implement impact tax, the infrastructure grows and city has to maintain it, and over time, actually. Yes, you have a lot of expense. That's right. Why, because I practice urban planning in Russia, and we always trying to implement measures to make city more compact because of exactly this point.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Most of the analysis of impact fees assumes that there's a one-time cost for infrastructure. It ignores maintenance issues. So you would want to include those things, and again, it makes an argument for compactness, because the more spread out the transportation network is, the more cost to run it, in addition to being more expensive to build. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You've mentioned environmental externalities. And as we know, all of us know that the trend of electrical cars is becoming more popular,
right.
And maybe in very near future we'll face a problem how to explain people living in cities that they should pay just for using the city or the center of the city just by driving the car. But this is the evident thing that you should pay for some environmental problems that are caused by driving the cars. But what is your expert opinion about how should we explain to people who are not urban planners or maybe transportation experts that they should just pay for using cars that are not making harm for environmental?
Okay, so a couple points. One is that electric cars are still going to congest the road. Point one. So you still need a congestion tax. Point two, electric cars are not emission-free because you have to generate the electricity to produce them. And so there are still emissions externalities for electric cars, and they're not as big as for gasoline-powered cars. So you still may want to tax electric cars for an emissions externality, even though they're not themselves producing any emissions. Let me just give you a little story about a related point. Some urban economists are starting to look at these types of questions, and there's a recent paper about self-driving cars. And so it's quite interesting because with a self-driving car, you can imagine the following thing: that the car, it takes you to work, and then it goes home and parks in your driveway, and then at the end of the day, it comes and picks you up again and then takes you home. And so the self-driving car is generating twice as many round trips as a car that you drive yourself.
But other people can use the same car.
That's true. So that's another consideration, that other people can use it. So maybe the car that takes you to work just goes off and drives somebody else around. So from an urban economics point of view, this issue of self-driving cars is quite interesting and complicated. And so I just refereed a really good paper on this question, and the answers are a little complex, but this transportation revolution is going to have big effects on urban form in the long run. Okay, go ahead.
I have a question regarding the study on how much people communicate with their neighbors.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in New York you don't want to talk to others. If you live in a suburb, you probably lack on communication. You want to talk to your neighbors. But I'm still suspicious, like what has been studied here. If you have a typical American city with a very dense downtown and development projects for poor and very low density suburbs, so then you don't have any traditional European kind of cities there where people talk a lot, where they develop a very fine culture and so on. Can you explain more on that?
I agree. So this may be just a purely cultural thing. It may just be the United States. It's not clear that it generalizes because patterns of interaction are partly cultural. And so everybody's sitting in the cafes in Paris and talking, blah, 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 on and on. Those are people are interacting like crazy in the heart of a really dense city. And so all I can tell you is what we found, right? And maybe you don't want to generalize too much, and maybe it doesn't even apply in Europe and Russia and Eastern Europe either. It may just be a cultural thing. But at least it provides some evidence on this question that seems to be so evident to a lot of other people about social interaction. It's a good point, Doug.
Can I add to this point?
Yeah.
Because I analyzed the difference in topology between functional zoning in America and Russia, and there is a morphotype that is missing in America that we have here in Russia, which is like a 5-story living building. It is a medium density dwelling between low density and high.
Right.
And this is actually Goldilocks density, which has the most interaction, because you not only you live in very small building where you can know everybody.
Right.
You're very compact. So when you live in low density, you have one neighbor, 2, 3, 4, 5, but the area.
No, I agree.
Yes.
But so, is there evidence on this for Russia?
Well, basically anecdotal evidence. I don't think anyone done an actual research on this.
I mean, I was a little surprised because I thought maybe, that we would find evidence in support of the view that low density is bad for interaction. So we went into this project without knowing what the answer was going to be, even though my urban planning friend probably thought we knew it ahead of time and cooked our data. That's one of the things he said we did.
And I think one more question.
Yeah.
Are there any institutional factors except market ones in the United States which regulate the city sprawl?
Well, I think a better way to say it is are there institutional factors in countries that are less market-oriented than the United States that affect sprawl? And I don't know enough about Russia and how land markets work here to know exactly whether Russia has less of a bias or more of a bias towards sprawl than the United States. So I think that, you know, if you think of the totally free marketplace as being a benchmark, the question then is, what about non-free marketplaces? Are they as prone to sprawl? I mean, China is another example. So China has a very interesting set of incentives for urbanization. In China, all the land is owned by the government, and cities can generate revenue by leasing land to developers. And what they do is they basically seize it from farmers and pay a really low price to the farmers. And then they lease the land out to developers, and they get the lease revenue, and it helps them balance their budget. So cities in China are paying, you know, almost half of their budgets in some cases from land lease revenue. And so you can imagine that this probably generates a force for urban sprawl in China. But then at the same time, China has a gigantic rural-urban migration flow. And so there's huge demand for urban residents in China. So it's not clear whether, you know, which is the cause and effect. But institutions are going to certainly matter in this urban sprawl process. It'd be nice to know what the answer is for Russia. I don't know. I'm not sure. It's very hard to learn in other countries' institutions, especially if you don't speak the language. But I think that urban planners would be, it would be very interesting for urban planners to try to study this problem and to kind of make a catalog of the ways in which sprawl forces are different in Russia or similar to those in other countries.
Thank you.
One more question. It's about cities which are on borders of states. For example, the cities on the border, how can it control the sprawl outside of the state?
Okay, say again now. You were cutting out there.
Sorry?
Yeah, say it again. You were.
One more time.
Yeah, just Luke.
How can the city control its sprawl outside the state where it is?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But so the city, the legal city presumably does not cross the state border, but the metro area does. Is that correct? Yeah. So we have lots of this in the United States. We have metro areas that span several states, like New York City is an example, and Chicago. And so the city really doesn't have any control over what happens in its suburbs. So the answer is that you can't. The city cannot really control the expansion of its suburbs, the sprawl of its suburbs into a different state. I think that would be the answer. So where are there examples like this in Russia?
For example, Moscow has own border, and around it there's Moscow region, which is the other region.
Yeah.
St. Petersburg, the same story. Krasnodar city has the Republic on its edge.
Right.
So it's common in Russia also.
So again, it'd be interesting to know what the policies are that have been adapted and how they're affected by this state, by this regional border. So I don't know the answer, but essentially you need a regional government to control sprawl in a situation where the cities spill over across state borders.
Well, here in Moscow, as far as I'm concerned, well, they sort of like try to cooperate in this matter. And well, there is a recent example of Moscow central diameter, so they are going to introduce rail connection between different cities in the suburbs of Moscow, that is Moscow region, that is another subject of federation, across the city via the main railway stations in the city center, for example, from the north of the Moscow region to the south via Moscow. That is to say, the railway connection will cross Moscow into the different subjects. So I say that, well, it is a unique example because, well, Moscow is the largest city, and if we say that Moscow is Moscow, Russia, it's
But are these railroads going to be commuter rail, or are they intercity?
Yes, this project is planned in order to reduce the commute times between, for example, the suburbs that are in the north of Moscow and those that are in the south.
But so, you know, that kind of thing is just like reducing commuting costs. It's going to tend to cause spatial expansion of the metro area. Yeah.
Okay, there are some other questions. Okay, Mr. Brukner, thank you for your presentation, for your expert opinion, and I believe such an economic point of view to urban processes and to the problem of urban sprawl is extremely useful for urban planners and especially for urban planners in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your lecture. It was very insightful.
Good.
If you would like, you can write down the differences that I found during my practice.
Yeah, please do. You can get my email address. Just Google me. I'd like to hear it.
Yes, I will write down because I found that there is a lot of minuscule details. For example, Russian cities sometimes have a lot of square space in the formal area, which allows them to expand a lot without actually going outside the formal border.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Sure, you can send us one. Yeah, just email me. Okay. Right.
I get some out of those questions. When one shop industries, they were deployed in Texas, they have by far the most pawn shops in the United States. And I give you your advice. Is it because of agriculture, regulation?
I don't know. Maybe there's some sort of regulation that applies.
In Florida, yes, it's very clean, but it cannot be clean just by itself. There was
No, there's an interesting research question. Why are there more pawn shops in Florida?
Those two states, they count.
I don't know much about pawn shops. Interesting. Well, both Florida and Texas are fairly loosely regulated states. Either state has an income tax. Just cultural and history. So they're both Florida and Texas are kind of Texas has low welfare payments to poor. Yeah. Texas is not a very generous state. Florida is a bit more generous, but anyway, it's interesting. All right, hold on.